All right.
I think you may have to give you the power. Thank you. There we go.
Okay. So on Thursday, my last patient was seeing me supposedly for a routine diabetes and hypertension check in a person who did have cancer. When he came to me, his temperature is 102.4. He was coughing vigorously. His whole family was coughing. And what his pulse ox was a little low. So Thursday, as in 2 days ago. And he'd had a negative COVID test from the lab. And I repeated his COVID test in my office. He wanted basically to lie down. He felt miserable. And I ended up sending him for COVID pneumonia to the emergency department. So the suffering from COVID is real. And for those of us who are physicians, and Tim will even, I think, can share it more than I, the suffering is real. This came from I'm a family physician. This came from the American Family Physician in a article that they published called The Diary. And Seiji wrote his experiences. Tears welled from my eyes, thinking about a patient who died this morning from COVID. She died alone in a busy hospital, despite her husband's pleaded visitor. I have 25 patients with presumed COVID on my schedule, so I picked up my stethoscope. At 8, at the respiratory clinic, I noticed an oxygen tank set up. My eyes followed the tubing to a woman sitting in a tripod position. And if you physicians here will know that tripod position is people lean to try to catch their breath so that they can get enough oxygen into the lungs because they're so short of breath. She's there. Her oxygen sat was 89. She didn't want to go to the hospital because she feared she would die. And Seiji wrote, I feared it also. He said, I grabbed a handful of almonds just as I received a notification on my phone, notice of patient death. How do I tell my team that 5 of our patients died in the past 3 days? He receives an email from his sister, also a physician and internist. Her husband is a pulmonologist, and they had 3 kids, and she wrote, Seiji, if something happens to me, you have to take care of our kids. And I hear a lot of anti-vaccine, and Greg has addressed this, but for those of us in medicine, the suffering is real. We see it, and it's not a joke. For those of you who said, I've never seen the virus, here's the virus. This is an electron micrograph. Why is it called a coronavirus? Well, you can see all the spikes on it sticking out and looking like a crown's spikes in a old style king's or queen's crown. These are going to be cilia from the human, but these are all the things. So now you have seen the virus, and people can no longer, when I show this slide, they can't say, I've never seen the virus. It isn't real. There it is. You can see it. I want to take you to the CDC and spend some time on how policy decisions are made. I'm a liaison to the group that makes the policy decisions. ACIP is charged by Congress to set civilian immunization policy that drives the Vaccines for Children program, as well as drives the program under the Affordable Care Act for coverage under commercial insurance. It's considered the standard of care. Usually the group meets and sets policy 3 times a year, but recently it's been monthly and a lot of meetings. I wanted to show you this is sensitive. All right, the agenda on Spikevax, Moderna's messenger RNA vaccine for February 4th from this year. And I show you because there's about 9 items on this. And so the manufacturer presents, then there are public comment, and a lot of that's on safety, some on the need for the vaccine. Then there are updates, VAST assessment. These are all safety. And so somebody who says that safety isn't, there's 3 agenda items, things, and safety also built into grade, ETR, et cetera. And so this is the agenda for the meeting. And I just come away, safety is looked at, it's looked at very seriously. This is the working group members as of then on the COVID vaccine working group. The COVID working group presents recommendations to the fuller group for vote. So this is a group that would need more behind. And I know a number of these people. Greg knows, I think, a lot more even. But I know a number of these people. I know their scientific character, their thoughtfulness, their training. Many of these people are vaccinologists well known to the vaccinology community. And there's lots of organizations. My group, American Family Physicians, AAFP, were one of the things. Sandra Fryhofer, AMA, there's public health, infectious disease, Jeff Dutchin and Carol Baker. You've got this, many of us know from National Foundation for Infectious Disease, Bill Schaffner. We could go through, I know a number of the consultants, first-rate epidemiologists and vaccine science people. So this is not done by a couple of people in a dark corner. This is the extent of the working group who has access to the behind the scenes, and then it's brought for public. So we're going to go and look at part of that day. I'm going to take you through pieces of two presentations. The first is GRADE. GRADE comes from McMaster University as an evidence-based, explicit way to grade evidence. And that's what it stands for, grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. That's where the acronym comes, applied to it, applied by the working group and the CDC staff member. This is not applied by the manufacturer. They start with the PICO question, and this PICO question is key because PICO talks about what is the population, what's the intervention, what's the comparison, and what are the outcomes. And am I picking up online or am I moving around too much? You're good. I'm good? Okay, good. Because if I'm good, I'm going to keep moving around. But if you tell me I have to, I will find some glue and try to make myself. But it's hard for me to glue myself. So PICO is needed because if you just say, we're going to go look at articles, there's over 3,000 articles on COVID vaccine. If you go to PubMed, that's when I did it back in May, just a quick look at PubMed. And so how are you going to do that? I recently looked at an anti-vaccine article that had no search strategy, and they cherry-picked the articles they wanted and the pieces of the articles to make their own conclusions. And that is not a legitimate scientific approach to cherry-pick the articles you want. That's fine for a opinion column, but that is not the way you do an evidence synthesis. And so that's the reason you need PICO, because PICO tells you what's the population, define it. They're looking at adults. What's the intervention? This is Spikevax at the full dose. What is the comparison? Placebo, nothing. What are the outcomes? And the key one we'll look at is hospitalization, but there's 6 outcomes they list there. And that is a PICO question, and that is what's needed to be able to do an appropriate evidence synthesis that's not cherry-picked. And so they did this. And 127 found from the WHO literature review. They found another 7. They screened them. They come out for 38 that met eligibility. They then looked at 33 being used, including 5 randomized trials, 2 safety systems, and 26 vaccine effectiveness estimates. So there was a real synthesis of literature done from that. The grading is then done with the randomized trials, the gold standard in medicine, and we're going to hear from Tim on that, is the top. Observationals come in at a level of 3, and then you can go up from 1, you can go down from 1 if there's a problem. It can be downgraded to 2 or 3 if there's problems like imprecision or bias that's found in the article. Or if there's a strong association, an observational type level 3 can be upgraded or downgraded if it's considered weak. And so then there will be a final evidence grade of 1 to 4 for everything. It's explicit. It is relatively reproducible to do that. And so here, let me just take one of the outcomes, and that's hospitalization due to COVID. They're going to be comparing vaccinees and non-vaccinees. Vaccine effectiveness in this 14,000 vaccinees and 14,000 placebo recipients. And so the vaccine effectiveness was 96%. Those are pretty good numbers when 28,000 people were randomized. So that's the outcome there. And then observational studies. So we'll look at the same outcome, observationals. here is 15 observational studies, pretty consistent, all pretty much showing evidence on the 90%, and when they statistically pool it, it's 95. If you go back, the last slide was 96, this is 95. Those are pretty comparative numbers when you have that close of things. So the grade is you got one RCT, but it's small number of events, and so they put the evidence level, even though it was an RCT, from 1 down to 2. From the observational studies, they were very consistent. So they would start with an evidence level of 3 as observational. They were bumped up because of the consistency and the strength. And so the overall type 2 and type 2, that is your evidence level for hospitalization with prevented by Spikevax vaccine. They also looked at serious adverse events. We have here, and I circled it in purple, serious adverse events due to the vaccine and placebo, 1.8 percentage versus 1.9 in placebo. Those are essentially identical. And you can see, again, 30,000 persons randomized to either vaccine or placebo, and a very small percentage of their adverse events. And again, they've looked at that, 2 observational studies, 2 randomized trials. The evidence type is a 2 for the randomized trials because of the imprecision, and in observational studies starts at 3 and they kept it at 3, and so you have a mix of 2 and 3, which would end up being then typically 3 as you use the weaker evidence, a moderate. And so here's the summary of grade. I don't have time to go through everything, but laboratory confirmed COVID with Moderna's high level of evidence, hospitalization moderate, death moderate, asymptomatic infection high, serious adverse events moderate, reactogenicity, which is sore arms and fever afterwards, high. Those are the evidence grades. Those isn't whether it was good or bad. That's the evidence grading, how good the evidence is. And so this is pretty good evidence. So now we're going to move from the grading of the quality of the evidence to the evidence recommendations. So these are the questions. Is it a public health problem? How are the benefits and risks? What are the values, acceptability, feasibility, and resource use, and equity? The intervention, again, being the vaccine. Is it a public health problem? Well, Greg and the deaths and my earlier statement shows you it is a problem. And if you look here, this is things, this in the purple is the fully vaccinated cases. This is the fully vaccinated with booster, and this is the unvaccinated. On the y-axis is your incidence rates, how many per 100,000. And it's pretty easy to see that if you're vaccinated or a booster, and here's deaths, here's the deaths of people who are fully vaccinated with a booster, death rates in those vaccinated without a booster, unvaccinated death rates. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Now, you also have to weigh the risks and benefits, and Greg showed some of the data used in this, and this is a graphic representation. This is looking at the risks and benefits of Spikevax among persons aged 18 to 39, looking at the second dose, where there's higher causes, higher incidence of myocarditis. So, per million second doses, there are 33 cases of myocarditis. Most myocarditis, and Tim can mention this later, will be hospitalized and sent home within a day or two. So it's usually a very short hospitalization, mostly for safety, but in and out with almost no sequelae. In contrast, from the disease, you would have 2,982 in that persons who prevented. So that's the benefit. So 2,982 hospitalizations prevented versus 33 potentially caused. I mean, is there any 9 to 10, that's a huge difference, a 100-fold difference there. And so that's how the evidence is synthesized to show the benefits versus things. And so here is the ETR domains, public health, yes, benefits large, risks and side effects small. What's the summary? Favors the intervention. What's the certainty of the evidence? Moderate to high. the values. Most people do not want to die from COVID. There is some variability, though. Some don't mind. Acceptability to stakeholders like physicians, high. Is it feasible to implement? Yes, we're doing it. We've had millions out. Is it a good use of resources? It's a whole lot better than shutting down or dying. And what would be the health equity? Probably not much impact on issues of equity. So now moving on. So God speaks, and historically, I think in a Reformed theology, three things happen. God speaks, and in the Genesis 1 and 2, we have the creation account. Creation occurs. God speaks by his laws of science in providence, and that's what us scientists study, is the providential working of God in holding all things together. And so that's the second area in the dark blue. And really, we're thinking what God does after him, as you well know. And then the third area God speaks is the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments. So it says in Deuteronomy, when you build a new house, be sure to put a railing around the edge. Then you will not be responsible if someone falls off and is killed. And so a very clear admonition for prevention. Again, in Deuteronomy, physical protection, even with human-made instruments, is seen as a blessing. May his towns be protected with iron gates. Animals who gored someone were put to death or were to be penned at penalty of death. And again, we have to see this prevention aspects. Love one another passages occur in the scriptures. Directly saying love one another should not be with just words, but in an action. Being vaccinated, wearing masks can really reduce the risk that one transmits the virus to others or hurts others, promotes justice, and avoids the justice concern and ethics of free riding. So when my children received measles vaccine, I paid for it, because I work at the university and earn a salary. So I paid for that vaccine for my children. I accepted that 1 in 10 million times there might be a serious reaction. It's rare. Hard to measure at 1 in 10 million with a 4 million birth cohort. But I accepted I would take that, and then I would be responsible for taking care of my child in that 1 in 10 million cases. And I contributed then to herd immunity by my children being protected and not being vehicles of transmission, provided the vaccine worked, and it usually does, about 94.5% effectiveness. That protected others. I did not free ride by asking others to get their kids vaccinated and thereby ride on the immunity of other parents getting their kids vaccinated so my kids wouldn't have to get a needle stick, or I wouldn't have to pay. It's called free riding. If it's done, it's considered an unjust act in ethics. What do we say? I would feel very guilty if I was the one person who came to this choir practice and infected 87% of the church choir, and having 2 of my persons in my congregation die as a result of COVID contracted in the choir practice where I infected them. It's real. Think about the infectious disease dynamics of loving one another. 1/3 of infections are spread at least asymptomatically. Almost half of the secondary cases are infected with someone in a pre-symptomatic stage, and that may even be higher with Omicron. The basic reproductive number for flu is about 1.5. So if you get flu, you infect 1.5 other people. For measles, as Greg pointed out, it's 14, I think Greg said 14, 15 in that range. Omicron was 9.5. I think Greg showed some things that the more recent one is even higher than that. One person infecting in this particular one, 9.5. If you work out herd immunity, which is 1 minus 1 over the basic reproductive number, it's about 93% herd immunity, 94 required to prevent measles in a population. That's at least 89% required for Omicron. And so that may be decreasing. 2/3 of COVID immunity historically has been from antibodies. And the antibodies you can develop from vaccination. So I put together, I think, a syllogism. Jesus commands us to love one another. He did that by giving his life, and we can do that by protecting one another's life and health. Jesus therefore commands us to protect the lives and health of others. If you can follow that syllogistically, just do the search and replace as you would in a syllogism. COVID is pretty unhealthy. I think we showed that. Therefore, I think Jesus commands us to protect others against COVID. And I think that's a direct deduction from his commands to love one another. And I put this out in the Christian Medical Society's website. It's posted there if you want to see it. I did want to talk just briefly about the excuse. Well, what I hear is God is sovereign, therefore I don't need to do anything. Analogic rebuttal. So you don't need to put gas in your car because God is sovereign. You can play in the middle, and you have your kids play in the middle of a busy expressway because God is sovereign. You can have kids carry around toxic poisons because God is sovereign. You can put anything in the predicate, depends how you say this, but anything in the one side, anything you want, if you're going to use God is sovereign as the excuse to get out of it. I don't question that God is sovereign. It's hard for me to understand. But we do have free will, as a Westminster Confession so well says. From all eternity, in his purpose, he's ordained what happens, but doesn't mean that he's the author of sin or that he takes away the freedom of contingency or second causes. Rather, the will of the created beings and the freedom are established by him. And I think really to say that we don't have any responsibility in COVID is a philosophy of determinism. It is not a Christian philosophy, and it leaves humans to dance on the strings of a grand puppet master. We're just little robots dancing in God's strings. I don't think that's a scriptural position. The other excuse that, God caused the pandemic and therefore we shouldn't intervene. Job did not know at the time of his trials what was causing his suffering. He did not understand the interplay of what was going. It's very clear from reading Job. It was Satan who killed Job's children, acting through nature within the limits set by God. It was humans who stole Job's animals. We don't know all of the causes. We don't see that. We're not given the privilege at this point in our lives of seeing it. We also have in John 9, Jesus is talking, Rabbi, who sinned? And his answer was, neither sinned. It was so that the works of God, the glory of God, might be displayed in this blind man. And he was healed, and providing him, I think, a real example for us. There is a lot of consequences of the fall. Most of us who are physicians see alcoholic liver disease sexually transmitted. We do see that judgment is a cause. Was Jesus wrong to heal? And when I hear churches saying we shouldn't be involved, well, was Jesus wrong in healing? Were the apostles wrong to heal? The Good Samaritan, the commands of Jesus in my life, verse 10, 7, and 8. Go preach the kingdom of heaven, heal the sick. So if God causes the pandemic and humans should not intervene, then it eliminates all medical care. Don't ever go to a doctor. And don't do anything in public health because you're opposing God if you do that. If this is your way of thinking, I don't agree with this allegation. So conscience. And autonomy is one of the core values in our culture, as Greg pointed out, but also biblically, because it's reflecting the imago Dei. It's reflecting the image of God. And we should reflect decisions based on conscience. I learned from Bob Orr, who was one of the greatest Protestant bioethicists in this world, that he said, well, he would not agree. He did not agree with Jehovah's Witnesses. Totally didn't. But he said, if somebody believed that they were eternally damned in hell for taking blood products, he would not ever force them to do that as an adult. Because while he didn't agree with their premises about that, he would not want someone to feel the guilt or the pain that they were going to be eternally damned because they received a transfusion. And so I think we have to be very careful to respect conscience. Well, we also these questions. Is this just herd thinking what I read on the, Twitter or Facebook, or is this really a conscience? How do you figure that out? I don't know. Does it require an inquisition? Can you really work it out? You have to have a letter from your pastor, a trial by the elder boards. What is it? How do you determine this conscience? Do you risk undermining the respect for persons? And so these are tough issues of conscience. Bob Orr came up with the Orr criteria for moral complicity. And the idea of moral complicity is you don't want to participate in something that is evil and therefore condone it. To use a silly example, you don't want to be the captain of a slave trading ship that's hauling human cargo in the slave trade. Even though if you were just the captain, you were just sailing the vessel, you were thereby enabling an evil action of slavery because you did it. And so moral complicity idea is you don't want to be involved, even if you're not owning slaves or you're not the ones who stole the people, you don't want to participate in something that facilitates it. So that's the idea. And so people say, are cell lines and vaccines created in cell lines, are they such that they're morally reprehensible and unusable? And Bob has these 5 criteria. Bob has passed away. But one is the timing. The cell lines are typically done in the 1970s and 80s when they were made. Can you drive in the road on the South made with slave labor? Can you use that road? This is the issue of timing. The distance. Cell phones that most of you have sitting on your desks may have cobalt from child slave labor in Africa. So are you going to use it now? Or is that supporting child labor? Are you going to throw your phones away? There's a trash can on the way out to deposit your phones on your way out. Things. What if a chemist teacher, and getting closer to home in the physics department, what if a chemist, talks about things, but the lessons in chemistry are used by one of the students, to make a bomb 5 years later? Is that teacher responsible for teaching chemistry, for teaching someone that is used to make a bomb? So these cell lines can be used for many purposes. They multiply. They don't require any new abortions. Those were passed. What's the certitude? How well do we know things? The certitude of vaccines work well. The history is pretty well known of the vaccines working, and we also know that cell lines were developed. Are vaccinees aware of that history? This is the issue of knowledge. Are drivers in the South on roads that were initially built with bricks from slave labor, are they aware of the road they're driving on is made with slave labor? Were you aware, how many of you were aware that you have a phone that may have had child slave labor from Africa used? I could ask for a show of hands. Were you aware? What's the knowledge? And then the intent. The intent here is clearly of vaccines is prevention of disease and protection of others. It's not for abortions. It is not for slave labor or any of those things. And so this is the Orr criteria. So you could also use the rule of double effect from Aquinas. Arguments that have been used is altruism. I had in Pittsburgh a church in which the pastor and his wife did spread COVID to some of the congregation unknowingly. It was actually, to me, a very redemptive, because once they learned it, they did not hide it. They told their congregants, and then they later served as their church for a place of vaccination. An incredibly redemptive story, even though congregants suffered physically, and I took care of one of those congregants from that. Most of the vaccines are not developed in fetal cell lines, really only the J&J. And if there is concern, you can administer those not developed in fetal cell lines, and the messenger RNA are not. I do have to say they are tested, meaning some of their things are tested in laboratory tests that have used cell lines, so you can't say there's nothing. You will see that on the web, but they are not developed. You're not getting any fetal cell lines. The Vatican is supportive of this and saying even though aborted fetuses were used for the cell lines, it is fine to do it. We also get into the issue of the least restrictive alternative, and that gets the issue of recognizing autonomy, self-determination, freedom of associations, freedom of movement. And it comes from looking at the institutionalization of the intellectually disabled. It used to be you had a child like I do with Down syndrome, you were told to put them in a home. They were not to be part of society. They were not to be in the schools. They were to be taken away. And they were not, and in fact, they were not to enjoy the same rights and privileges because they had Down syndrome and intellectual disability. And that's actually things. It was based in part on eugenics and social Darwinism as the things. And so the two parts of it were, again, we're recognizing that, and then looking, secondly, that the authority, the state, cannot be broader than the legitimate goal. So the least intrusion on personal rights, and clearly taking kids away from their parents and institutionalizing them was really going far beyond. So we have the issues that have to be then addressed with the least alternative, including closure of schools and businesses, mandates for masks, and vaccination. And the Supreme Court, they looked at the COVID vaccination of healthcare workers. And that mandate in Biden versus Missouri was upheld by the Roberts Supreme Court. And they said CMS has the right, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, which pays for the hospitals, because there is other regulations that are under physicians and other healthcare workers do, because of fear from COVID that could lead patients to avoid care, because of CMS's functions authorized by Congress, that it was upheld by the Supreme Court to mandate healthcare worker vaccination, and that is the current law of the land, or the ruling of the land, shall we speak, and was supported by American Medical Association and American Public Health Association. However, the Roberts Supreme Court did not allow mandates for non-healthcare workers. And there was an OSHA mandate, so a different part of the federal government, that applied to 84 million. And in a 6-3 decision, the court ruled, citing really the Constitution's separation of powers, and said Congress is expected to speak clearly if an executive agency decision is of vast economic and political significance, and cited that historically such matters have been regulated at the state level, not at the federal level, and cited that the threat of emergency powers really hits constitutional liberties, and that really you're going a little beyond the outfit. So that was the Roberts decision to say mandates of non-healthcare workers were disallowed by OSHA, not disallowed by states, not unethical, but disallowed because of the separation of powers. So there are some pros and cons. And as I look at it, autonomy, I mean, clearly you'd always let somebody do what they want. But when you list pros and cons, really the only con for healthcare worker COVID mandates is autonomy, letting people do. Everything else, free riding, disease risk, protecting patients, including presenteeism, because if you turn up sick at work and you can't function, that's presenteeism. You're there, but you're not functioning well. And that has, in medical care, concern for patient safety. Healthcare worker shortages. I was burned out by COVID. I can tell you that. And Tim can speak to that as well. I think we've seen that a lot in medicine. Patient reassurance, if they're afraid they're going to go to the hospital and get sick, they're not going to go. And then we do have a healthcare worker is a privilege to serve. It is not a right. There's no constitutional guarantee to be a healthcare worker. I think that for a mandate for the general workforce, the pros outweigh the cons, but it's not like the last one where it's a slam dunk. Here it's more, you of course have economy and you have free riding disease burden. But labor and production shortages, that really varies on your locale. And the client reassurance, they may avoid if they're worried about the production shortages. There is a risk into staffing certain, but a lone trucker is a very different than a waitress or things. And so I think the majority of principles favor a mandate, but I don't think it's a slam dunk like healthcare workers. So if you look at the view of personal rights and liberties, you mandate the lowest degree of coerciveness possible. If you look at harm reduction, in contrast, then you do the lowest. So again, the first one is if you're looking at personal liberties. But if you look at harm reduction, what do you do for the population? Then you lower the risk. You try to achieve herd immunity. You immunize the minimal number to achieve herd immunity. But that's going to be 89%. That's essentially everybody. And so if you do it from a harm reduction, you do end up in a pro position. But of course, you can use mechanisms from persuasions to penalties to incentives. So you have lots of things. A new analysis said that the vaccines could have prevented over 300,000 COVID deaths in our country during the pandemic. Now, I want to take that 300,000, Pittsburgh's what, 1.2 million? So that's a quarter of Pittsburgh. Dead unnecessarily. Now, you can use whatever percentage you want for what's the percentage of Christians in this country. Pick a number, because you can find a poll to back you depending on how you define Christian. But let's just pick 40 for the sake of argument. 40% times 318 is 127,000 deaths of our brothers and sisters unnecessarily. 127,000 brothers and sisters dead. Speculations, I agree. I think I have it my own way attitude. We are going to have problems. Waves of COVID will occur. Boosters will be needed. We will need, boosters that have the variant of Omicron and then the next Omicrons. We do want to have conscience. I don't want to see it thrown out. But the duty to protect, the love of one another syllogism, to me, is what we should be primarily doing. And I think the mandate for vaccines for healthcare workers meets any ethical criteria. Less compelling for others, but you really do have to think about what it means to love one another. So those are the ends. I'll take a few questions. Then if we have time, I have a closing story, but we'll do questions first.
Okay, thanks.
Jesse.
So to go back to earlier, 2020, would you say it's true that because Americans would not wear masks, the lockdown?
So the question is, because Americans would not mask in 2020, was the lockdowns necessary? It's a good question, and I don't have all the answers. I think it's very clear that, and there's recent data, which I won't go into the details on, but HEPA filters, and this I would say for churches and businesses, HEPA filters make a difference. And air conditioning, heating systems really should have. That's not your mask question. Masks make a difference. The quality of mask matters. The fit of the mask matters. And the use of the mask matters, because masks hanging down here don't do anything to protect the nose. So quality, consistency, and of the mask matter. If you won't have if a population will not mask, then, and your epi is high, then you may have no other choice but to close those establishments in which transmission is occurring. And so I'm going to pick on the bar owners, but if you're going to go to a bar and you're going to dance with whoever the honey is you meet at the bar counter, and you're obviously not dancing with masks because you just had a couple drinks, that is a high-risk situation. Lots of people on the dance floor masking, unmasked, close proximity, and many have had more than enough to drink. That is a high-risk transmission setting, and if you have to close it to stop the transmission, then yeah, I think you have to. But I also think that the local decision on that, to know when there's enough epi that you need to do that, is better than having, these great geographic swaths of territory closed.
Could you just comment on the couple months that we spent with people like Dr. Fossey at the national level saying masks don't work. That really stuck in the public psyche. So what was going on behind that? And you know, were mistakes made, or was that just kind of like the right call at every point in time?
Well, I've been an infectious disease epidemiologist for a while, and it's very clear from well before COVID existed that masks interrupt transmission of viruses. That's the reason when you go to an operating room, particularly when you're going to do a hip replacement where sterility is key, you often had special airflow, and I've already mentioned having a special airflow, and people were masked. So we have known that masks stop transmission of viruses and bacteria, and we have known that airflow is important, and that is not new, and that was known before the pandemic.
So why did he say that?
That was not my knowledge. Greg, do you have an answer?
I might shed a little light on that. And this is one of the, so let me start by doing this. One thing to add to Rick's excellent talk that he didn't mention because he's so used to it is the agendas that he showed you at ACIP and it's true for FDA, completely public and transparent. Anybody can watch them and see the same data. What Fauci, I believe, was saying, which gets misinterpreted, I'm not defending it, but we don't have evidence that that's not the same thing as the absence of benefit. But at that point, now, should he have said that? I don't think so. It was reasonable speculation at that point to assume the greater precautionary principle and tell people wear masks. But even now, I mean, I don't want to pick on anybody, but in this room, people are not wearing masks properly. And a lot of them are wearing cloth masks, right? Those are far less effective. And the masks are not crimped around the nose, there's airways around. So even as a group of people knowledgeable and interested, so what do you expect from the layperson, right?
So there's a question in the back, I think. Over here. Matt, do you still have a question?
Well, yeah, I have a bunch of questions. I'm really thankful and in some ways thankful for a chance to talk. It's not always been easy to find forums to talk about some of these things. The question I have related to masking has to do with transmission. And early in the pandemic, there was a big emphasis on transmission through the particles that were required to be close. I don't remember the term for it. And then touch. Remember back early 2020, everyone was like wiping off their groceries. And then there was a transition that summer in a discussion about aerosol transmission. That it wasn't just that you hit someone with your saliva, but it was going to stay in the air. And I remember in the summer 2020 reading articles by scientists who were arguing for aerosol transmission, and they were pleading with the World Health Organization to recognize that as a method of transmission. It seemed like a really key development in the pandemic because now we suddenly recognize outside is hugely better than inside. But we go back, even summer 2020, certain states were closing their beaches. And we look at it now, we're like, that's so silly. People are outside. But it did seem like there was, within the medical community, a delay to recognize aerosol transmission, which now, looking back on it, we all kind of assume no one wipes their groceries off anymore. And we think a lot about airflow, not just 6 feet and don't get hit by their spit. So just hoping you could comment a little bit on how that developed over time. Was there a slowness to recognize that? How does that process happen over time?
For those online, the question is, what about aerosol transmission and the time it took for public health authorities to recognize that there is a component of aerosol transmission? I think that there was a number. So I'm a flu epidemiologist, and so for flu epidemiologists, and this is kind of like hand to nose. Yes, there's direct contact. A lot of large droplets that are going to be within my breath sphere, and some aerosolized. And the degree of aerosolized versus large droplets varies by the virus. There's different viruses. Measles can do more long-term aerosolized than probably any other virus that I can think of. Maybe, Greg, you think of another one, but measles is certainly one that does even more than SARS-CoV-2. So I was not personally in agreement. I thought that this is a respiratory virus and that it would behave like all the other respiratory viruses. Nobody knew the amount that would be direct contact versus large droplet versus aerosolized. That proportion does vary by virus. Nobody knew that at the outset. I think they were a little slow, so that would be my criticism of the public health, of recognizing what things. And I think and I realize, people were scared because of SARS-1 and MERS, which are other coronaviruses, and the deaths that occurred and the caution that needed to be. I think we overdid the contact, the direct contact, and we underplayed the aerosolized. But I do have to say, we didn't know a lot early on. Next question.
It's more of a chronological quibble than a question. Lockdowns were started early March 2020. Pennsylvania didn't get a mask mandate until first week of April 2020. A lot of that reason was, I was reading the various media accounts, was that masks were basically very hard to get, that there was a nationwide shortage of it, and it had been attributed to Dr. Fauci that he urged people not to mask as the general population in order to conserve the supply for healthcare workers. But instead of saying that was the reason, he said that we haven't proved it's effective to ordinary people, which caused people, it probably made, I think that harmed his credibility later on. His credibility might have been more needed. And of course, the Black Lives Matter protest was another in May, June 2020. It probably also harmed the credibility of public health, the policymakers and policy spokesmen.
Yeah, so just to repeat that.
So yes, a comment was made that Dr. Fauci's credibility might have been hurt when he talked about masks not being proven. I mean, we of course didn't have time at that point to have proven masks for SARS-CoV-2, but we knew that masks worked for other respiratory transmission, and there was a shortage of masks. And instead of just saying there's a shortage of masks, leave them for the healthcare workers, he said we didn't know enough, and that was the point that might have been on credibility. I wasn't in his shoes. To me, masks make a difference, and that's my plea for America, is to use masks when you're in a high-risk situation or around high-risk people.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We talked in the previous meeting about the difference the way scientists talk to each other and the way they talk to the public. And oftentimes, unfortunately for us, the public figures like Bill Nye, who's a PhD, or Dr. Fauci, have a much louder voice than anything you or Greg is saying today. And so if they are perceived as not credible, then there's a huge impact on the the whole society at that point. So those credibility issues really matter quite a bit. Let's see, we have a question in the back.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier about how we can possibly get basically a bigger bang for our buck in terms of prevention if we do more like precision lockdown. Like you mentioned, closing bars, but we also heard a lot about how there's so much variability in COVID based on the variant, geography, local levels of transmission, and so that requires probably a lot of constantly changing lockdowns, like, oh, this area is a high level of transmission, or these specific situations and establishments should be closed. And that's going to change pretty rapidly. But that messaging to the public is so difficult, and frequently the best way to get buy-in from the public is to have simple messaging, and simple messaging means broad closures. So it's almost like you have to have a broad message, you have to maybe almost do more harm in terms of like economics or other costs to the public to get the protection of those. So can you comment on how maybe it seems impossible to do the least damage to get the most harm just because it's so difficult to communicate that to the public?
I think health department officials have a real hard job, and I wouldn't want their job in communicating. I think we do need layers of protection. We need vaccination. We need air filtration with HEPA filters. We need to be outside when the epidemiology is bad and open windows. We need masks. We need a variety of measures. In protecting people, you don't have just one. And there's one other, and Tim is actually a better one to mention, but I do want to mention one other thing that we have not heard yet today. You can't overwhelm your hospitals. When you overwhelm hospitals, then people who have heart attacks die because there's not enough beds in the hospitals. Or people who have cancer who need big surgery can't have surgery because the ventilators are all occupied by SARS-CoV-2. You cannot overwhelm the medical system. And so I think you have to have an elastic messaging system that includes the hospital bed occupancy. If it is high, then whatever you have to do to protect the people with heart attacks, the people with strokes, the people in car accidents, you have to do that. And if that means lockdowns, that means lockdowns. But when there's lots of hospital beds open, you don't need to have as intense mandated things. You need to do that. It has to be elastic. And I do not want the job of the county health commissioners who have to make those decisions. But with that, if you overwhelm the hospitals, you hurt the heart attacks, the strokes, all the people suffer.
We have one question from the internet that I'm going to have to close it off.
All right. And I have that one story if you have the time.
Oh, okay.
Comment or question from David B. was saying, regarding the mask mandate, early in the pandemic, was there not a lack of awareness of significant asymptomatic?
Sure, we didn't have the data. I mean, yeah, scientists, we know from flu that there can be asymptomatic transmission, but how close the analogies would be to flu versus how close they would be to MERS and SARS, SARS-1, we didn't know. And, omniscience is not part of getting your MD degree, nor getting your doctoral in public health degree. That's only known to our Lord, and I think we have to admit our frailties in what we know, but we also do know a lot of infectious disease epi-principles. They were established years ago, before SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, final story. And then
All right, there was a hermit, well-renowned for his expertise, for his knowledge, and people came to him for many miles to seek his advice. Now, there are some youths that were not happy with this revered old man, and they wanted to put him to shame. So they tried to trick him. They failed. They couldn't figure a way to stump this old wise hermit. They finally came up with a way to stump him. They were going to take a bird, a little sparrow, hide it, and ask him what it was they had. If he guessed a sparrow, they ask alive or dead. If they say alive, they kill the sparrow and produce the dead. If it says the opposite, then this, they have him trapped. Old man, we have a question for you. Yes, my sons? Oh man, what do I have? My son, you have a bird. Oh man, what kind? You have the sparrow. All right, old man. Is it alive or dead? My son. It is, as you wish it. Greg and I have made a great case for infection control in homes, community, churches, for vaccination. And I say that to a certain degree, in the body of Christ, the handling of COVID is as we wish it. Thank you.